You guys, I got my hands on some Nutiden yarn and it just arrived. In today's episode, I'm going to talk to you about how I got my hands on some of this beautiful unspun yarn. I'm going to talk to you about my first impressions on working with unspun yarn, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my plans for what I'm going to do with this gorgeousness. So grab a cup of coffee or your beverage of choice and join me in talking about my new friend from Sweden. Hello and welcome to the Clarity Fiber Arts podcast. My name is Jody and I am the owner and the dyer behind Clarity Fiber Arts. If you're new here, a very hearty welcome to episode 3 of this podcast. And if you're a returning viewer, thank you so much for returning for episode 3. It is my hope, my sincere hope, that with each episode, my filming capabilities get a little bit better, my editing capabilities improve, and that you find this podcast a place where you can learn something new, share some tips and advice with each other, and just generally make some new knitting friends. I can be found on the interwebs as Clarity Fiber Arts on both Instagram and Facebook. And I also have a little Etsy shop that I talk about later in the podcast under Clarity Fiber Arts. So I just put some yarn in the dye pots downstairs, and I thought I would come up here and talk to you a little bit about how I got my hands on the Nutiden yarn. This is my first experience working with this gorgeous unspun yarn from Sweden, and I just thought that some of you would benefit from knowing how I went about it. I was a newbie to this type of yarn. I first heard about this yarn from Bella of the 100 Acre Wool podcast, which if you're not watching that podcast, you need to. It's such a beautiful podcast full of information, beautiful knit design, most of which is hers, but she knits a lot with this yarn, and just watching her and her designs, I just completely fell in love. But my experience with ordering was a little unusual, I would say. My first searches for Nutiden yarn brought me to their main website, and unbeknownst to me, I was just searching for Nutiden yarn. And I will show you, I don't know. So the company name is actually this name right here. And I'm going to guess that it's pronounced Onoroche. I could be butchering that, I'm not really sure. And so in my search for Nutiden yarn, excuse me, when I Googled Nutiden yarn, it brought me to this website. And at that time, I wasn't really sure if this was just another person selling this yarn or whether or not that was the company name. So that's the company name. And this is where you go to order the yarn. So after I clicked on the website, I immediately was faced with a message that said, the shop is closed at this time, and it gave an approximate date for when the next shop update was scheduled. And so I immediately knew then that this was not a situation where you can just go and order Nutiden yarn, but you have to wait for their shop update. They are a small I would say, production company in Sweden. And so they produce all their yarn based on in batches, and so rather than just having a constant supply, it's more of a curated yarn. And so they come out with various colorways within their shop updates, and then that amount of yarn is available for that shop update. And so, as you can imagine, sort of getting your hands on it is a bit of a, what I would say is a competitive process. So I immediately set out about to finding out how I could get my hands on some of this yarn. And I'm trying to think of how actually the events went, but basically what it came down to was there was a certain amount of yarn available in the shop updates, but if you are a Patreon of their company, you have availability to early releases in availability of this yarn. And so based on the fact that I really wanted to get my hands on this to knit my husband a cardigan, I became a Patreon, and I'm really so happy that I did. Caroline, one of the owners of the company, really puts out some beautiful episodes of her podcast in which she talks all about the yarn, the different breeds of sheep, how she's using it, the properties of the yarn, things like that. And so I really find it beautiful. I enjoy watching her podcast. There's some Swedish music involved. And I became a Patreon at the level of $6 a month. They give you the option. There are less expensive options. And so, but I chose to, there were not spaces open for the lower options. And so they only have a certain amount, I believe 250 slots were what Caroline has chosen to keep it at this point. And so I was really lucky enough to be able to become a Patreon at the $6 a month level. Now, this was immediately before a shop update, and so I was not able to have the benefit of having the early release of the new fall line of yarn, which they have. And so I believe I became a Patreon like 2 days before the shop update, and so I wasn't available to hop on to that one. However, it did unlock for me the ability to watch all the beautiful videos that she has. She shows some real beautiful footage of the sheep, talks about the process, how they make the yarn. And so all of those things really interest me. I am a bit of a nerd when it comes to process. I love to know the process of things and how things work, and sort of dissect yarns and what they're composed of and things like that. And so if that kind of thing really interests you, I would suggest becoming a Patreon, and then there's tons and tons of benefits to also, having access to early releases of the yarn. So let's see, the yarn took about 2 weeks to arrive. I did hop on to the shop update on the day that it was released. I think I talked about in my last video how, based on how I was feeling with becoming a Patreon and looking at all the different yarns and things, I had asked my husband whether or not he thought I should, because the time zones are different. Here in the United States, it would have been like 1 a.m. to get on and get some of this yarn when they open their shop in Sweden. And so I said to him, do you think I should set my alarm for 1 a.m.? And I did that, and I promptly shut it off. I was tired. It went off at 1 a.m. and I just shut it off and hoped for the best. and jumped on to the shop update around 7 a.m. So it had been about 6 hours since the update had started. And when I got on at 7 a.m., most of it was gone. Most of it was gone. And so people are getting on there, and I'm assuming the Patreons then got to scoop up, you know, some of the beautiful colorways and things that were in less of a quantity. And so, not that I'm disappointed at all, but this is the colorway that I wound up getting. This is called Silhouette, and it's sort of a variegated gray colorway. Apparently the backstory behind this was that it was developed for Canute's birthday, in celebration of his birthday with the multicolors. And so I did get on there to get this. Prior to getting this, I tried to attempt to figure out how much I need. And if I'm being honest, again, the process of figuring out what you need for a particular sweater is a little bit tricky because this is unspun yarn. And so it doesn't come with, you know, a certain a weight of yarn. Like this is not, as you can see here, it's sort of, we'll go into this a little bit later, but it's sort of like this lofty sort of piece, very airy and very light piece of wool unspun. And so it doesn't have, it's not fingering weight, it's not DK weight, it's just this amount of yarn. And then I was sort of, I have a pattern in mind, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And so they come in quantities based on grams. Now, as you can see, it comes in plates. And so when your yarn arrives, it comes in these plates. And as you can see, this plate, oh, that looks like a heart. I love that. This plate is a little bit larger than this plate. And it does tell you that on the website. It says you order in grams, in weight. And so you can either order a certain, sorry, I'm trying to think of how to say this. So I ordered 500 grams of this yarn, and the other quantity is a lesser quantity. I believe it's 100 grams of each plate. And so I knew that I'm knitting a cardigan for my husband, so we're talking about pretty much yarn here. And so even though it was difficult to figure out, I knew I needed at least 500 grams of this yarn to knit the sweater. Now, I will say that Caroline does generously offer to her Patreons the ability to send her your pattern that you're hoping to knit, and she can attempt to help you figure out how much yarn you're going to need. But as I said, all these new experiences with unspun yarn, I went ahead and ordered 2 quantities of 500 grams because I knew that for the sweater pattern that I was knitting, I wanted a thicker weight. And so I needed to hold this strand double in order to attempt to achieve the size that I was hoping to get. So first impressions with working with this yarn are, as I said before, that it is very delicate. Even in trying to find the end of the yarn in the plate, the yarn broke a couple times. It feels very light and airy and sort of just delicate would be the word that I would say. But in doing some research, and again, watching Bella from 100 Acre Wool, the first thing that I remembered from watching her podcast was that putting the yarn into a ball is really helpful versus just sort of unwinding from the plate as you go. Gives the yarn the ability to sort of roll off of the ball as you're knitting. And so the other thing that I noticed and that sort of made me a little fearful was that it kind of sticks to itself. And so as I started to try and find the end of the yarn, it was sort of grabbing on itself and further creating a little bit of a issue for me, or a fear, I should say. However, it's that grabbing action of the strands of wool that also make it very strong. And so one of the things that I learned in my research of working with this yarn is to ball it up. And again, I am holding 2 strands of yarn. So I make 2 balls of this yarn, and then I pull them from each individual ball. The other thing that I learned that was really helpful to me is sort of how to position your hands when working with this yarn. So I'm gonna go ahead and just pull this yarn apart for you so you can see sort of how floofy it is and light and airy. So as you can see, if I give just a little tug, it's almost just like roving. It comes apart in a very sort of airy sort of nature. Okay, so that's what you're dealing with right off the plate, okay? Now, if I take another strand, so I'll take the opportunity to show you one more time. Let's get a little bit longer here. Okay, so here it is, and floof, which is kind of cool. All right, so now I'm gonna take these 2 strands together, all right, and show you several different things that I learned about the unspun yarn. Number one is that you can ply them together, all right? So either you can splice them together, or you can sort of do a rubbing action with your hands. But before I show you that, I want to show you something else that I learned from another source, in that if you keep your hand close and pull, you can sort of see that I'm really sort of tugging. And so that floofy sort of wispy nature goes away as soon as you put the plies together, and as soon as you sort of bring your fingers close, which is kind of important later on, as I'll show you with the knitting. Bring your fingers close and sort of keep your attention from being out here when you're pulling on the yarn in any fashion, whether you're casting on, whether you're, you know, and that's where I found, when I show you the swatch, that's where I found the most difficulty. And so sort of choke up on your yarn, for lack of a better word. Okay, and sort of keep your attention within a shorter span. So that's the first thing. Second thing is when you do ply the 2 pieces of yarn together, obviously they become stronger. And so just a little heat from your hands will, as you can see, sort of ply that yarn together. It always reminds me of a dreadlock. Ply the yarn together and create something much, much stronger and thicker than just the original strand of yarn. And so those are the things just on a preliminary basis that I learned. So ball up your yarn, keep your tension on the excuse me, I got a floof in my throat. Keep your tension on the closer side, and then also go ahead and ply the yarn together if that's what the pattern calls for. I did see some people in my research knitting with it at a fingering weight, which they can achieve through just working with a single ply of yarn. And the other thing that I did here is that people sort of pre-draft their yarn. And so the people working, see, I can't even get this apart now. Well, I sort of can, there it goes. But it won't come apart very easily. But people working with just this amount of yarn sort of pre-draft and sort of pre-rub the yarn together as they would sort of when you're spinning, roving, ahead of time as they're knitting. And so they just kind of go along, and then they get this, which is much stronger, and then they go ahead and knit with it. So I did create 2 swatches for the pattern that I was hoping to knit. I will tell you that when you're new to this yarn, possibly once you work with it and learn the properties and learn how your gauge with this yarn, it might be a little bit better. But there were several things about working with just making my swatches that I can tell you made getting gauge a little more difficult for me. And primarily that was the delicate nature of the roving. I felt very much like I'm a tight knitter, and so I was very fearful of knitting tightly for fear of breaking the yarn. And in that vein of breaking the yarn, if you do break the yarn, one of the things that you need to know when you're working with this type of yarn is that it's really not a big deal because of the properties of the sort of raw nature of the wool. It can be just plied back together, no problem. But having never knit with something like this before, it is sort of always in the back of your mind. And so when I did cast on my first swatch, there was sort of this moment of like, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself into here? This stuff is delicate. It is, it breaks easily, and just a little tug on it will create some problems for you. However, just a few of those tips to follow, and I was well on my way and knit my first swatch in a couple of minutes. And so the recommended gauge for my cardigan that I am knitting is a size 10 needle. So it calls for Brooklyn tweed yarn in the pattern, and that of course is a thicker weight of tweed yarn. And so I knew definitely that I had to hold 2 strands of this together. So I went ahead and made 2 small balls, cast on a 14 stitch by 22 row gauge swatch, and this is what I got at that gauge. Now, first swatch, I was really delicate with my wraps. I knit English and continental. I tend to go English just because of some thumb pain that I have, and so I did start out on the safer side and use my English method. But you learn when you knit with this type of yarn, really the real nuances of how you knit. And so I know that when I throw my yarn, and the way I throw my yarn, it's heavy-handed, tends to be tighter, things of that nature. And so I quickly learned that that wasn't going to work with this yarn. And so as a result, my gauge swatch has, you can kind of see there, it's sort of airy. There's a lot of holes in it. It was knit on a big size 10 needle. But I was pulling very, very minimally with that yarn when I was sort of throwing it around the needle. And I would say, you know, this is not a good representation of my gauge, because very light-handed, and the resulting fabric is very sort of airy and full of holes. The pattern in the sweater that I'm knitting calls for a moss stitch. And so you can kind of see here, because of the fluffy nature and the halo, on this swatch, I did not get like real good stitch definition. You can kind of see there that it's an uneven fabric in the moss stitch, but can't see a real distinct order of the moss stitch. And so that's my gauge swatch on a size 10 needle. So as an experiment, I went down to a size 9 needle. and set about my next swatch with a determination to hold my yarn closer, to not kind of throw with my hand way out here, which is what I normally do. So I did again, kind of choke up on the yarn, knit super close to the tips of the needles so as not to put a lot of tension on the yarn as I was sweeping through, but definitely tried to not be as scared this time, and put closer to my normal amount of tension on, because if you're gonna knit a gauge swatch, you better do that anyway. You better figure it out. And so as you can see, compared to this one, bit of a size difference there. This is a size 9 needle. It did produce a much more dense fabric. Right here you can see a little more stitch definition in there, and that the moss stitch is coming out a little bit more. And on this particular swatch, I did get gauge. And so the pattern calls for a 10.5 size needle. I went down to a 9. And I think this is where I am going to stick. I got a perfect 4x4 gauge swatch, and there's some open stitching in there, but truly not anything that bothers me, and I think this will produce a really nice fabric. This was blocked. I put it in a little bit of soak, and that was another thing that I learned about working with unspun roving, is that it's best when you're blocking to pick a yarn soak, a wool wash that need not be rinsed, to avoid agitation and felting. And so what I did with these swatches is just soak them overnight in a little bit of soak, gently wring them out, and then place them in a towel and sort of roll up the swatch to get a little bit of a little more of the water out, and it dried very quickly. So that is my initial impression. I don't have much more to say about the yarn, except that I had an excitement about knitting with it, and also a fear of the unknown at the same time. So it was sort of like a little bit of a tense situation, which sounds funny for yarn, but I like that kind of thing, and I like to discover new things about working with the yarn. And so yeah, I think it'll be fine. I think I have to get over my fear of handling the yarn so delicately, but yeah, that was my first impression. I did list a new colorway in the shop. I just finished photographing it, and it is over there as we speak. This is the new colorway, and the title of this is called Cowgirl. This is set on a 100% merino superwash yarn. There is no nylon in this yarn. I like to use this style of yarn, the style of fingering weight yarn, to knit shawls, because I think that the drape is a little nicer than a yarn that contains nylon and tends to kind of pull in a little bit more. And so we really get a nice sort of drapey effect. And there's the third skein, so you can kind of see. It's really pretty. It's variations of tones of brown, a little bit of cream in there. There is some speckling in it, as you can see, and then also a little bit of gray. And so that is over in the shop on a 100% merino nylon base, fingering weight 100 grams, and you get 420 yards in this skein. And so it is a variegated yarn and has some real sort of nice tones of brown, a baby powder blue, and a gray. So head on over to the shop if something like that interests you. for your next project. And one other thing I wanted to mention, something new that I tried after seeing Andy of the Naughty Knitress work these up on her circular sock machine. I have started to knit adult size hats on my circular sock machine, and I'm thinking about listing these in my shop as well. I am scheduled to do a fiber festival locally here in November, and I know that these types of hats do really well at fiber festivals. I have yet to decide if I'm going to put a pom-pom on it, but I think a pom-pom would look super cute on these. This is a hat that I did an experiment with some of my scraps of yarn, and so you can see it is a two-toned sort of situation. These are double thick hats, and so if you don't put a pom-pom on it, you can actually turn it inside out and sort of have a different colorway in your hat. And so when they're knit with two different colorways, you actually get a two hats for one, so to speak. So let me know in the comments what you think about these. If something like that would interest you to be placed in the shop. Let me know what your thoughts are on pom-poms versus no pom-pom versus removable pom-pom. I tend to like the little leather tags that go on right here on the brim too, but then you know, that would sort of prevent you. Some of those you can take off as well. They're not permanently fixed in there, but yeah, let me know what you think about these cute little fingering weight sock hats. That's what the pattern is called. It was for a sock hat type of situation. This was knit on my 64 cylinder Erlbacher with an equal slot ribber. And so I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. This size fits an adult size head. I had to fiddle a little bit with my gauge on my machine, but yeah, I'm pretty happy with how these turned out. This one's a little small, would probably fit, you know, a teenage size head maybe, or a little bit younger. Child size head, definitely too big for like a toddler, but it fits my head pretty good. And so, yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. All right, thanks, bye-bye.